wonderful world of Disney. Ringo, the Refugee Raccoon.
Seems like civilization has come quite a ways since man first moved into caves to get away from the wild animals. But in spite of how long and hard he's tried, he's never been completely successful. In fact, no matter how big his cities get, and some of them nowadays cover hundreds of square miles, there's always a fuzzy area around the edges where men and animals sort of share the territory. And sometimes there's a question of which one gets the better deal. Oh, naturally, there's not much trouble anymore with the lions and tigers. But a lot of other smaller critters just never seem to get the hint. Take, for instance, the edge of this particular Southern California city. Right here, just a stone's throw from the last row of houses, was a whole community of wild critters. This is the story of one wild family, probably the one best suited to live right under man's nose, a family of raccoons. But it's also the story of the neighborhood where they made their home. For countless generations, it had been a pleasant place to live and raise a family. And of course, it still was. Though in the last few years, the city had been growing constantly closer and closer. Ten weeks ago, with the chill of winter still in the air, Mother Raccoon had born 3 kits deep in the heart of the old oak. Now it was spring and time for some basic lessons in the business of survival. The first lesson was fairly simple: how to get down from an old oak tree. Of course, in every litter, there's always got to be one maverick. And this young fella, let's call him Ringo, had the idea there must be a quicker way down. It took some time, but he found it. Well, now that that was over with, the next order of business was learning to find something to eat. The first stop was at a nearby stream for a little demonstration of how to get caught by a crawfish. Mother made it look easy. Just grope around in the mud until one catches you, then eat. But when the kids tried it, they soon found out it wasn't all that simple. Before long, though, the whole family had mastered the art. As usual, it wasn't much longer until Ringo had managed to come up with a variation on the theme. Next on the agenda was a patch of berry bushes Mother Raccoon had had her eye on for several weeks. By now, they were sure to be partly ripe, enough for a snack anyway. She was quickly joined by 2 of the kits But the unexplored country off the other way was just too much of a temptation for Ringo to ignore. The first thing that attracted his attention was the tremendous variety of bird life in the area. He hadn't gone much further when he began to find there were some interesting things right down here on the ground, too. It was just an old bull snake, perfectly harmless, but not exactly friendly either. Mother was so busy with the berry bush that she hadn't even missed Ringo yet. By now, he'd run a good ways off, but he'd calmed down, and he was about to bump into another kind of critter that was a good deal more friendly than the last one. It didn't take long to get the introductions over with. And about then, the fawn decided it was time for a little game of follow the leader. It was fun for a while, but pretty soon Ringo zigged when he should have zagged and found himself running straight towards trouble. Instinctively, he headed for the home tree. Well, Ringo had learned a couple of valuable lessons today, but survival in the woods wasn't all there was to life. And sunset was the signal for the beginning of the most important phase of his education. The thing he was going to learn was that while the woods provided a variety of tasty tidbits, it was the city that served up supper. And from long experience, Mother Raccoon had a regular itinerary all worked out. First stop was invariably the garbage cans in the back alley. Tonight, the pickings were good, but garbage cans were a kind of a chancy proposition. Sometimes they were even empty. The next course, though, was a sure thing. It depended on the fact that some human beings were just natural-born suckers for raccoons.
Okay, I'll be right there. Here you go, plenty for everybody.
Well, so much for the basic training. There were people that were pushovers and others who managed to make it pretty clear they didn't want raccoons around at all. Just down the street, though, lived a much more typical human family. And earning a handout from them required a very special technique, the old clown routine. Mother made her entrance first and warmed up the audience a little bit. Then the kids came in, and they stole the show completely. It was a surefire act, guaranteed to warm the coldest heart.
Here you go, Chris.
Thanks, Mom.
Of course, as soon as dinner was served, the show was supposed to be over. But as usual, Ringo had to be different. In fact, he got so carried away, he almost forgot what they were here for in the first place. With the best of two different worlds to pick from, life for Ringo and his family was full and easy for the next few weeks. Then one day, something happened that marked the beginning of a big change in the whole woodland way of life. It didn't seem like much at first. Just a couple of men tromping through the woods and making funny noises at each other.
Boy, is this going to take a lot of clearing. You said it.
Of course, Ringo was at a little disadvantage. He couldn't read. So naturally, he couldn't know that these were the plans for a big new community development. And his oak tree was right in the middle of it.
Let's go over to the other side. Right over here. You bring the chain over this way. Okay, measure off 200 feet.
All the commotion was more than a little bothersome to most of the critters in the glade, but Ringo, on his perch at the top of the tree, felt safe enough. Matter of fact, to him, the whole thing was kind of entertaining.
That's it. Good. Mark it. Okay.
Pretty soon, the men began pounding some strange-looking sticks into the ground, and Ringo's curiosity got even stronger. The fact was, he could hardly wait to get down there and see what they were all about. It was late afternoon when the men finally packed up their gear and left, and life in the glade slowly began returning to normal. It wasn't until nightfall, though, that Ringo finally got up the nerve to come down and take a closer look. Well, the sticks didn't seem so interesting, but those ribbons on top were just too colorful to resist. Stronger than he thought, though. It wasn't long before Ringo's brother and sister got brave enough to join the game. By the time they got there, the score was already 3-0 in Ringo's favor, and it didn't look like they'd ever have a chance to catch up. It was a big night for the raccoons, but the truth was they weren't about to hold up progress. Next morning, the surveyors were back. Of course, they weren't especially amused by what had happened, but then they weren't especially surprised either. It just meant there was a lot of wildlife around, and they'd have to make sure it wouldn't happen again.
Let's pound them in deep this time.
For the next few weeks, there was so much going on in Ringo's part of the woods that he found himself ranging further and further off, just to stay out of the way. On the edge of town, too, there was a lot of activity that, of course, he couldn't understand.
Bring the line over here.
Okay.
2 degrees right. Good. Mark it.
Ringo didn't know it, but this was the last day of the preliminaries. Next morning, the assault began in earnest. Always the most curious of the kids, Ringo naturally headed for his favorite branch to get a better look at what was going on. The rest of the family was just too scared to move. family hadn't been hurt. And of course, they did the only thing they could do under the circumstances. They headed for the hills. For Ringo, on the other hand, there seemed to be no escape. He ran in panic all that day. But no matter where he turned, he couldn't get away from the monsters that were everywhere in the woods. It was some time later that Ringo came across a house he hadn't seen before. This house, too, was strangely quiet. But one thing was different from all the others. The door was open. Right now, Ringo's exhaustion was stronger than either his hunger or his fear. And all he could see was a soft place to curl up and get some rest. Even the footsteps in the ceiling wouldn't keep him awake now.
One at a time.
As it happened, the footsteps belonged to Ringo's landlord, the mouse of the house, a pet who had somehow got left behind when the family moved out. Next morning, Ringo woke up with just one thing on his mind. He was hungry, and there didn't seem to be much else to do but just to start looking. The fireplace wasn't too promising, but sooner or later, something was bound to pop up. Friendly little fella, but he sure didn't taste like much. Well, now, there was something looked a little more flavorful. Ringo tried his best boarding house reach, but it fell kind of short. Oh, well, there were still a lot of other places left to explore. It wasn't until he got to the next room that Ringo finally found what he was looking for. Sure would be easier to eat, though, if the food would just hold still. Well, naturally, this was the first time Ringo had ever been on television, but he made a big splash right away. In fact, it wasn't long before the audience was eaten right out of his hands. That was when Ringo noticed the audience. Foiled again. Seemed like the mouse knew every place around here that was big enough for him and too small for Ringo. The chaos of the day before had been just the beginning of a series of tremendous changes in Ringo's old neighborhood. With modern machinery and methods, whole new communities could spring up from raw land in a matter of weeks. As soon as the area was cleared of trees and brush, the land was reshaped with graders, bulldozers, carryalls, and earth movers. Next came concrete for streets, sidewalks, and foundations. Then prefabricated framing sections were brought in by the truckload to be assembled on the site. New houses took form at the rate of nearly one a day. Eventually, of course, what food there had been in his house was gone, and Ringo was forced to spend the nights prowling the area for something to eat. With the people gone and the nearby houses empty, he found himself drawn to the construction site. It hadn't taken him long to learn that the workmen often left scraps of food behind at the end of their day. Tonight, there was something new in the way. Of course, the fence had been put here to keep people out, but it didn't prove much of a barrier to a raccoon. The watchman was on duty as usual, but that didn't bother Ringo a bit. In fact, the first place he headed was straight for the watchman's shack. There were almost always a few goodies lying around it. Right away, Ringo's nose told him there was food up there. All he had to do was climb right up and help himself. Yes, sir. All he had to do was climb right up and help himself. Well, finally. Deviled ham. The watchman didn't know who'd been in here, but apparently there were prowlers around, and there was too much valuable material stored on the site to take any chances. Of course, Ringo didn't know he was being followed, and after his snack, he felt the need of a little drink. No use bothering with this mud puddle, though, when there was fresh water coming from right over his head. The only problem was how to get to it. Now the watchman was convinced there were pranksters on the property somewhere, and he had to get them before they caused some real damage.
Go on, get out of here. Get out.
Ringo's night on the town had turned out to be a little wilder than he'd bargained for. And naturally, he headed for the one safe place he knew. Of course, there was one thing he didn't know. Starting tomorrow morning, even this place wouldn't be safe anymore. For Ringo, the next day started with a bang.
Put a block under that end.
Take him into the pizza chain over here.
Hold it right there. Not a crack. It'll hold fine.
Looks solid to me.
We're okay. Let's hit the road. Okay, fellas, let's go. Okay, level her off. Yeah, it's got it.
The window was tight as ever. Ringo was a prisoner in what was about to become a mobile home.
Jack it up a little higher.
Turned out the start of the trip was the bumpiest, but when they hit paved road, things began to settle down. Matter of fact, it wasn't long before Ringo forgot all about his fear and began to enjoy the scenery. Of course, he didn't know it, but Ringo was part of quite a parade. Out front was the pilot car, whose job was to clear traffic ahead. Next came the pull truck and the house it was pulling. The follow truck brought up the rear, partly to keep traffic away and partly to make sure the house was holding together. All three vehicles carried radio gear, so they could communicate in case of trouble. It wasn't long before the trouble came. Stop the truck. The house is on fire. Ringo had been brought special delivery right smack into the middle of town. And like a newcomer in any town, it was just a matter of minutes before he was the center of attention. In the water, Ringo probably could have handled the dogs one at a time, but 3 against 1 was just too much. Then suddenly the situation took a turn for the better.
Operator? Operator, I have a small problem here. Maybe you can help me out.
It looked like Ringo was out of one kind of trouble and right into another. This time, though, wherever he was, he had quite a bit of company. Well, it happened that Ringo was on his way home. Not the place he'd been born, but a brand new home. A preserve set aside and maintained exclusively for wildlife and far from the intrusions of man.
Okay, out you go.
It didn't take him long to find a comfortable hollow in an old oak tree. There was even a vaguely familiar scent on the breeze. It was coming from right over that way. One thing was sure. Ringo wouldn't have to go any further than the ranger's cabin to find his supper. Yes, sir, his days as a refugee were behind him now. Looked like everything was going to work out just fine.